don't believe the latest hype. You have to dig deeply.
They kind of did a botch edit to make me look as bad as possible.
And there's a lot of people that have lost jobs that can't get any compensation. So I'm trying to do this walk to raise awareness.
We opened the show with an absolute bombshell. RMIT Fact Lab engaged in censorship for profit, and thanks to some great work by some of Australia's best independent journalists, we have the documents to prove it. Here at the Aussie Wire News, we are your connection to the truth. That means that when someone else breaks an important story, it is our pleasure to connect you to that source, rather than simply ripping off their story and pretending it's ours, which is what most other news outlets do. Well, last night, Rukshan Fernando dropped what is quite possibly the biggest story of the year so far. We now have the smoking gun, the conclusive proof that RMIT Fact Lab were paid up to $800 for each fact check, for up to 50 fact checks per month, amounting to over 700,000 Australian dollars a year. The links to Rukshan's reports on this are in the comments, and I highly recommend that you watch his videos. It's all based on documents that were released as part of an ongoing court case involving Avi Yemini. Rukshan goes through what's in the documents and also highlights some other issues, such as RMIT Fact Lab appearing to be non-compliant with Meta's own requirements for their fact-checkers. If you want to know more about that, then you'll have to click on the link in the description and head over to Rukshan's reports directly. What I want to highlight are some serious ethical issues with the way that this relationship between RMIT Fact Lab and Meta was structured, and, in my non-lawyer opinion, some serious legal risks that RMIT now faces. Firstly, the ethics, and specifically the perverse incentives. Paying on a per fact check basis with a cap for the maximum number a month creates an obvious incentive to find 50 things to fact check every month. The incentive is quantity, not quality. Making matters worse, there is no mechanism or penalty for if the fact checkers themselves get it wrong. So not only is the incentive for quantity, but the quality of the work quite literally doesn't matter. They could have drafted an agreement that created very different incentives. For example, a fixed monthly fee for analysing up to 50 pieces of suspected misinformation per month. Then there's no incentive for them to go looking for things to fact-check or to make work for themselves. And then add to that some sort of a KPI or perhaps even financial penalties for if the fact-checkers get it wrong themselves. And at that point, you'd have a pretty robust set of incentives to ensure that the focus is on quality fact-checking, not merely meeting the quota. But they didn't choose to draft that agreement. They went simply for one that's incentivized quantity. And sadly, it shows. I've read many of these so-called fact-check articles, and most of the time, there were some exceptions, some were very good, but most of the time, they just amounted to lazy appeals to authority. The fact check amounted to, we found a qualified person or a peer-reviewed study that said something different, so you're wrong. Which is all well and good, except that that's not how facts work. And oftentimes, the person that they were saying was wrong was actually more qualified, and their study was of a higher quality than the authorities that the fact-checkers were using to declare the others wrong. For example, Professor John Ioannidis, perhaps the most preeminent epidemiologist of them all, did some research very early in the pandemic and estimated the infection fatality rate was probably about 0.26%, a number that has proven to be extremely close to being correct. And he had that figured out way back in mid-2020. I got fact-checked for posting about his work that came from one of, if not the greatest epidemiologist of all time, work that proved to be absolutely correct. But worse, the fact-checkers actually didn't understand what he was even talking about. He was estimating the infection fatality rate. The fact-checkers responded by declaring he was wrong because the governments had a case fatality rate that was much higher than the number that Professor John Ioannidis was giving, which is true. But the case rate, that being deaths divided by the number of test-diagnosed cases, is not the same as the infection fatality rate, which is deaths divided by the number of infections estimated using seroprevalence data and other indicators that can estimate the number of people who were infected, whether they knew it and were tested, or whether they did not. They are two different numbers. So the fact-checkers didn't even understand Professor John Ioannidis' work, and were certainly not qualified to declare his information false, but they did it anyway because they pay no penalty for being wrong. At least not yet. More on that later. So we had this absurd situation where uni grads and academics are being offered financial incentives to find fault with people far more qualified than they are. And they do so simply by finding a different authority that contradicts the first one, sometimes without even understanding the issue that they were fact-checking at all. And often the authority they'd rely on was themselves less qualified than the one that they were fact-checking. It's lazy censorship for profit based on appeals to authority, and they almost got away with it. But they're not out of the woods yet, because in my non-legal opinion, they may have created enormous legal risks for themselves and RMIT. And those chickens may very soon come home to roost. Think about it. These fact-checkers, well, they suppressed honest and true information and helped to spread misinformation. We know that. I'll give you an example. Rigorously tested, safe, and effective. Sound familiar? Fact-checkers used them often and suppressed warnings from people who cautioned that they were in fact rushed and both their safety and effectiveness could not really be known given how little testing had been carried out at that point in time. We now know from the Pfizer papers that not only were they not rigorously tested, they were in fact rushed, but there were also clear warning signs from the little testing that they did do that their products caused adverse reaction rates far higher than what is considered acceptable in the industry and didn't stop transmission. Those are two things that we now know to be true. Now, they knew them back then. We now know and have documented proof thanks to the Pfizer papers that rigorously tested, safe and effective was misinformation. And it was spread by the fact-checkers, including RMIT Fact Lab. Now, I'm no legal expert, but I do have to wonder, what would happen if somebody who has been, let's say, vaccine injured, were to sue RMIT Fact Lab for medical misinformation? I mean, can RMIT Fact Lab legally declare medical products to be safe and effective? I mean, there's all sorts of laws about who's qualified to say what when it comes to medicine. Is RMIT Fact Lab compliant with them all and qualified to give life and death medical advice to the public? I can't answer that question, but I would love to see it asked in court. Anyone who is influenced or reassured in any way by RMIT Fact Lab fact-checking and has since been injured by the jab should perhaps be having a chat to someone who is a lawyer. Because whilst our government gave immunity to the manufacturers, they didn't give it to the fact-checkers. Now, far be it from me to give anyone ideas, but I'll point out that I can't run that case myself because I never took the jab, so I don't have standing. But if you were influenced by the fact-checkers and then got hurt by the jab, then maybe you do have standing. Where it gets really interesting for me is that in Victoria, where RMIT Fact Lab is based, directors can be held personally and criminally liable if their organisation hurts someone. Which means that if a court were to find that RMIT Fact Lab had some sort of liability towards a vaccine-injured person because RMIT Fact Lab gave them the false belief that it was tested safe and effective, then, well, I'd need some popcorn for that one. That'd be fun. Remember when I said that this is the year when the pushback starts in earnest? Well, this is what the pushback looks like. People like Avi Yemini fighting the courts and the kind of court battles that gets this information into the public. People like Rukshan Fernando breaking this story. People like me amplifying this story and helping to get it out far and wide. And hopefully, the right people speaking to the right lawyers to see if there is a case to be answered here. Again, and to be completely clear, I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice, but I'm just wondering. And I think it's a good question. And if I was from RMIT's Fact Lab, or in fact a director at RMIT more generally, I would certainly be having a long chat with a lawyer just in case. Maybe they should have fact-checked themselves before they fact-checked the rest of us. Now here's the news. No doubt you, like me, have seen headline after headline recently about record heat temperatures, new global records for heat being set. You wouldn't know it from the southeast of Australia, where it's been pretty wet and cold and rainy, but that's the global news. I wanted to learn more about this because those of you who know my work since 2009 will know that I've done a lot of work speaking to actual scientists and experts on the issue of climate change. How good are our records? How well can we actually measure the climate in the first place? And how confidently can we attribute changes in temperature to any specific cause? Well, today's no exception, and I have someone, it's my great pleasure actually, someone I've never spoken to before, Dr Judith Curry. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
My pleasure.
Now, just for those who may not be familiar with your work, you are the former head of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. You're no slouch. You're no armchair general when it comes to science and atmospheric science in particular. You've got an ongoing role now that a company that I'd love to hear you talk about. But can you give us just a very brief précis for those that have never heard of you before? Why should your opinion on this subject actually be important to them?
Well, this is something that I've been working on as a research scientist for 35 years, both in the academic sector and universities for many decades, and recently in the private sector. I have a company, Climate Forecast Applications Network, and I work with people, companies, governments making real world decisions about how to manage weather and climate risk. And so, again, one of my focuses is on realistic assessments of uncertainty. So don't believe the latest hype. You have to dig deeply and try to understand all the uncertainties and all of the different perspectives before you can draw credible conclusions.
So let's do exactly that, because there is a lot of hype right now. We have seen some significant hot temperatures in places around the world. That's turned into headlines about record heat. What is behind those headlines? What is the substance here?
Oh, it's hot. Okay, no question. Globally, temperatures are high, and regionally, there's some heat waves. I'll give you an example in the U.S. We're currently in the grip of a big heat wave in the western and southern parts of the U.S., and people are just going, ballistic and crazy. The catastrophe has arrived. Well, this particular heat wave is comparable in magnitude to one we saw in 1980. Right. And both of these heat waves pale in comparison to one that we had in 1936, long before carbon dioxide was any kind of an issue. The point is, there's a lot of variability in weather and climate. We have a chaotic system, and random processes can tweak the whole thing in unpredictable and surprising ways. And this has always happened. But thinking that this is something really unusual, it usually isn't. Anytime you see an extreme, you go back into the data records, into the early parts of the 20th century and into the 19th century if you have data, and invariably you're going to find worse extremes. And then if you're fortunate enough to have paleoclimate data in your region, you're going to see even worse. It's rare that something is identified in the recent data record that's particularly exceptional.
Now, they argue, of course, that all we've seen since the 1930s or so, we saw some warming, and then we saw a brief cooling period. I believe it was 1940 to 1970. That's off the top of my head, if I recall correctly. And we've been observing some warming since then. We are in an interglacial period. However, to give credit where it's due, the prediction was made that as we increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, we would see increasing temperatures. How do you work with the data, and what do you believe is driving the observed increase in temperature over time, if not anthropogenic global warming?
Well, CO2 is, definitely a factor, increasing greenhouse effect, gases. That story. It is a factor, but is it really the dominant factor? Well, we really don't know, because we don't adequately understand natural climate variability, the solar impacts, the multi-decadal to millennial scale ocean circulation patterns that redistribute heat throughout the Earth system. We don't adequately understand all that. So we don't have a definitive assessment as to how much of the warming has really been, caused by CO2 emissions. Particularly with regards to solar, that there's disagreements about how to calibrate the recent satellite data record. We don't really understand all the solar indirect effects. So this is really one of the known unknowns, how the sun is, affecting our climate. We just don't have sufficient understanding at this point. So there's a lot we don't know.
You're on the record stating that there is no climate emergency. Is that based on there's too many uncertainties and we can't be sure? Or do you actually, do you have a thesis that says, no, I can confidently say that there isn't a climate emergency and here's why?
Well, I recently published a book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. Mm-hmm. Okay, it was published a month ago. And what it is a thorough assessment of the uncertainties and a real risk assessment of, what's going on. There's so many hidden assumptions, value assumptions, political assumptions in this current climate catastrophe paradigm, that we get thrown at us sort of nonstop. And so I deconstruct all of those and I look, carefully at all the risk and propose, more thorough ways of actually assessing and understanding our risks. And in context of the complexity of the socioeconomic situation that we're in. I mean, right now, what people are proposing, the cure of eliminating fossil fuels, I mean, the near-term consequences of this are imposing risks that are far greater than any climate change risks we might encounter in the coming decades. That's an example. And there's lots of, different strategies for managing risks in these deeply uncertain conditions. And that's what my book talks about. So whether you call this a crisis or an emergency basically depends on your values, and what's at risk. There's a lot of irrational response to all this. One of the biggest things is confusing the slow creep of warming with what I would call emergency risk associated with extreme weather events. These are, two separate categories of issues, and trying to use concern about extreme weather to motivate eliminating fossil fuels to slow down this slow creep of warming. I mean, to say the least, it's illogical and not going to help anything.
Well, Dr. Judith Curry, thank you so much for your time here on the Aussie Wire. And personally, thank you from me. You're someone whose work I've followed now for well over a decade. And along with the likes of Hans Rosling, Bjorn Lomborg, Matt Ridley, and many others, I've been able to build a picture. I personally had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Fred Singer, Professor Fred Singer, the late Professor Fred Singer, before he passed away. And between all of you, I've been able to build a bit of a picture and wrap my head around many of the concepts that you're explaining for us here today. Thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire, and I look forward to having you again as this story no doubt continues to develop, because climate change alarmism is not exactly going to go away anytime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In just a few weeks' time, I'll be in Perth again, this time speaking at the Church and State Conference being held on the 4th and 5th of August. Get your tickets to the Perth Church and State Conference via the link in the video description and use the code Topher10 to get a 10% discount on your tickets. I'll see you there. Those of you who watched the episode of the Aussie Wire News from Thursday of last week will remember that I talked in my opening editorial about this book right here, A Rebel from the Start by Avi Yemini. I gave my thoughts on the book then, but I wanted to get some thoughts from the author in this episode here. Avi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, mate. And thanks for reading the book, because I can see a lot of the people talking about the book online actually haven't read it.
Well, that's one of the glaringly obvious things. It's no offense, it's not exactly a complicated book to read. It doesn't take an enormous amount of time. It took me about 10 hours to smash through it. And so there's
you'd know now after reading it, it was written by a year 8 graduate.
Well, I was going to say, I was actually surprised you managed to get a couple of 4-syllable words in there, which was impressive. I wasn't sure that you were going to quite get to that point. But it's actually a delightful read. It's a very easy read. And I said in my editorial last week that I was very cautious of you early on because I believed a lot of what I heard. And so as I read through this book, I could remember back to things that I was hearing. I lived in Melbourne as well. I was also involved in the alternative media from 2009 onwards. And so you were a person of interest because of your outspokenness and so forth. And I actually made the decision not to go and train in Krav Maga at the IDF gym because I didn't want to be associated with you. We actually made that decision, my wife and I, when we were deciding where we were going to get some self-defense training. So that's
interesting. I didn't know this.
No, you wouldn't. I've never told you. That day that I interviewed you for Battleground Melbourne, was the first time we'd ever really properly met. We'd passed each other at protests and so forth. And by then, my attitude towards you had softened a little bit because I'd seen you do some really outstanding work with the protests, etc. But when you first came out in support of the anti-lockdown protests, I went, oh, not that guy. I don't want that guy associated with with us, you know. So obviously, I've had a radical shift in views, and that's kind of the point of this book. Can you tell us what motivated you to want to write it in the first place?
Well, I think you explain it perfectly. For so many years now, so many people have had their say about me, told my stories from their perspective, often either cutting out the context of stories or the important parts of the stories, or, cherry-picked parts of my life and stuck them together in a way. They kind of did a botch edit to make me look as bad as possible.
Sure.
And look, at points, I dare say I made it quite easy for them. And when you read my book, you can see. And so I guess this is, I don't know, don't they like when people reclaim their story? This is me reclaiming my story. Now I'm letting people, there were parts of it that I couldn't answer for years. And I've just waited to be able to put it all together so that you can read it from beginning to now, and hear it from me. And, the funny thing is that nobody questions the book or the truthfulness of the book if they've read it, because I'm not really soft on myself. I don't give myself a free pass, and it's not easy. I'm just really honest. It's brutally honest to the point that if you've actually read it, it's true.
This I resonate with that. It has the ring of truth. And I'll give one example for those that haven't read the book yet and really should read the book. You talk about two particular incidents of combat experience when you were in the IDF. And in neither of those anecdotes that you give are you particularly flattering to yourself. In neither of those are you trying to pretend that you played Rambo and you were some hero. In one of them, your weapon jammed. And you even talk about the fact that people kind of misconstrued what that meant, and your commander was trying to make you a bit of a hero because you'd gone with him with a jammed weapon, and he's kind of like, oh, wow, that's amazing courage. And you were not trying to sell that story at all. No. I find this a really...
he would happily sell it for me still today, I think. I'm friends with him still.
Yeah.
And I don't think he believes me, but that is God's honest truth. And that's what I wanted this to be, my true story, warts and all. And I'm really excited because it's a weight off my chest to be able to, fans, firstly, those who love and follow my work and have supported my work. Well, firstly, I want them, this is the first opportunity for them to hear the stories that they've heard about me, that they've often defended me or minimized or whatever without being armed with the facts. I want them to now have an opportunity to arm themselves with the facts and to know the truth and to know that, in fact, you didn't pick a bad guy. You're not actually defending a guy that did these awful, evil things. You're defending somebody that's human and that has a human story, probably like somebody else your neighbor, your friend, anybody, because parts of my story are so typical in our society today, and other parts are kind of extraordinary, experiences that most people probably won't have in their lives. So I guess it just makes it an interesting read, and to think I writing it was sometimes a bit confronted by the experiences I've been through.
It is. I finished it and went, you've lived half a life, but in that time you've lived at least 2, maybe 3 of them. And in fact, at one point your life very nearly ended. Can you just tell us the very brief version of that story?
Well, I think it was a couple of times. Maybe you skipped a few pages, but no, I think you're talking about my heart attack. Is that the one you're talking about?
That's the one. Not the bullets. Not the bullets landing on the ground around you while you jumped out of the back of the truck.
Not the drug overdose.
No. Tell me about the heart attack.
Yeah. That was a few years ago. After it was just before COVID. In fact, I was recovering as we were coming into COVID, and we were looking back at it, thinking, "Wow, lucky it happened then and not a bit later." Because there probably wouldn't have been a response by ambulance. But yeah, I just got my kids back a week before. I had the fight of my life. It was the most stressful time of my life, and I came home from the gym and I lay down for a minute and, or I was supposed to lie down for about an hour and set up an appointment or a few hours. And my wife found me unresponsive, thought I was joking because
this is a
thought
theme.
I was playing
this
games.
is a theme in your book of people being in genuine distress and people not believing you because they just think you're being a larrikin again.
I'm like the boy who laughed wolf or something, where I've always joked about everything, and then when shit gets real, I'm often not taken seriously until I am. And in that case, I was when she realized I can't fake the color of my skin going gray. And I just, I've had a few of these experiences in my life where I am literally the luckiest person in the world. And as cliche as that sounds, it's true. When you read my book, you think, how does anyone survive that? And then that happened and then survive that. I have a lot of those moments in my life. So on one hand, that's probably what's got me through so much, because you think, whatever, when my detractors call me whatever horrible name they call me, which they've done for years, and a lot of people, including my wife, how do you handle it? I'm thinking, I'm so insignificant, in the grand scheme of things. We're all passing through. I died a few times, really. I could be dead tomorrow. I'm just happy that for once I get to show people my story, and for those that are interested, and even not only fans, I think there's a lot of people, I think the majority of people who are not invested in me being the good or bad guy, they've seen some of my work, they may have agreed with some, not agreed, but they know I'm a personality that brings certain stories to life.
Sure.
And, they may have not shared something because they thought, I've heard these really horrible things about this guy, and I've never defended myself in the public arena. I've never given them another side of the story. And I guess that silence is an admission of guilt in most people's minds. But if you actually understood how our system works, it often isn't. So for me, it's finally giving even those people, so fans and people in the middle, and just detractors, something to be angry about. I love now. I saw that they're going on about how they were mocking me at first that there were no sales, and then when it got to the number one bestsellers, they're starting to share videos how you beat the bestsellers algorithms. These guys are just such clowns, and I love it. So I think it's ticking all the boxes, and I'm really happy with the feedback I'm getting from pretty much everyone, including people that were skeptical of me, that are telling me, sending me messages, telling me they were skeptical of me, but they after reading my book, it's put it into context for them, and nobody's going to excuse some parts of the book, even me. But that's the point: is it gives you the context and the truth. And what I often say is, with all the things that they call me and name me, they're all wrong. There's a lot of criticism you could throw my way. It's just not what they're using.
Well, Avi, from my perspective, I had, of course, the opportunity to interview you for Battleground Melbourne, and that was really the moment when I discovered that so much of what I thought I knew about you was completely wrong. And what you just said before about how they're criticising you actually for the things that you're innocent of, and there's other things to criticise you for. I literally realised that as I was sitting there, and we were looking at each other through cameras. If you remember, you had a teleprompter screen in front of you, and I'm staring into a camera lens, and it was all set up so that you'd be...
My wife doesn't let me forget it, because apparently I shouldn't have worn the ripped jeans.
And hey, I just thought it was part of the persona. But honestly, I expected here is what I'd invented in my mind, was that the Avi Yemini was insecure and egotistical, and that's where the over-the-top larrikinism and attention-seeking behaviour and all of that came from. And I really thought that what I was going to find was a shallow veneer of a person behind which there was just insecurity and unfounded ego and everything else. That was what I'd kind of built in my head. And we sat down and I'm interviewing you. And I mean, I'm going to interview you anyway, because I couldn't tell that story without your perspective on it. You were an important part of that story. So it's like, okay, fine. I just have to swallow my pride and interview this guy and include him in the story. And then I sat down, and it was very, very quick you just began to break what I thought I knew about you. And you were actually very self-effacing. It was clearly this was not a veneer, this was not a facade. You were actually just being one of the most genuine people that I've actually come across. And in the times we've come across each other since, we've showed up to barbecues and gone, oh, hey, you're here. I was having a meeting in a coffee shop one time and you just happened to walk in. On all the other occasions where we've crossed paths since then, you've proven yourself consistently to be exactly what your haters say that you're not. They attack you in the very areas. So my hope is that this book is going to do for others what that interview did for me. Because I regret the fact that I didn't reach out to you and get to know you a lot earlier, because I actually think you're a top bloke. Now,
Appreciate it.
On that, what is next for Avi Yemini? We know you work for Rebel News. You're doing incredible work there. You've travelled the world a couple of times now, going to Davos and back. You've been to, you tried to get to New Zealand. We're still fighting that one. What's next for Avi Yemini?
We're in New Zealand is next.
Okay.
So the official book launch is I'm kicking it off in New Zealand because I don't think I can find a more appropriate place on the planet. The censorship capital that tried to ban me and chased Posey Parker out. So we've announced that actually 25th and 26th of August is the official book launch is kicking off in New Zealand. So that should be fun.
Yeah.
So at the moment look, over the last few years, we've just followed the stories and we've gone to tell the other side of it. Whilst now I also have a bit of the book tour to do as well, because the last thing they want to see is too many people knowing the truth about anything from what happens in Davos to the lockdowns in Melbourne to my personal story. Anything that goes against the narrative, we've actually got to fight to get it out there. So I appreciate you letting people know about it. And you could probably, if people want it, they can go to rebelfromthestart.com. That's the easiest place to get it. What's next? We'll see. Watch this space.
Excellent. Look, we'll put rebeltothestart.com as a link into the description of this video. I congratulate you.
Rebel from the start.
Sorry, Rebel from the start. Rebel from
Put the right link in at least, mate.
Sorry. Listen, I'm giving you free publicity. No.
It's written on the front cover of the book that you're holding.
All right. Does it have the A? Just so I don't make a mistake. Does it have A Rebel from the start?
I think that also goes that way, but it's rebelfromthestart.com. I think it's redirected in case it was a complicated decision whether you have the A or not.
I can relate so much. We argued for a long time about the in the Aussie Wire. But look, this is, all jokes aside, this is a genuinely brilliant book. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It will sit on my shelf with pride. And, I'm very happy to have gotten to know you and very happy to have discovered a couple of years ago just how wrong I was about you. And I hope that other people do the same through this book. Avi Yemini from Rebel News Australia. Thank you so much. Well, my next guest is a familiar face and a familiar name to anyone that's been following my work, anyone that's watched Battleground Melbourne, and in fact, many of you may already be following him on social media. Matt Lawson rose to, I guess, fame, infamy. I'm not quite sure how you would describe it, when he became the first person to be shot with a rubber bullet during Melbourne's anti-lockdown protests. Now, Matt, of course, had already been hard at work for a long time before then, trying to raise awareness of the oppression that was happening in Victoria and trying also to bring peace and de-escalate situations between police and protesters. And for his troubles, he was the first one to get shot. Well, Matt has been through hell ever since then, and anyone that's watched Battleground Melbourne live would know. But that hasn't stopped him, and remarkably, he's going above and beyond and doing something that I would never even contemplate. But you know what? I've got the man himself online, and I'll get him to tell us what he's doing. Matt Lawson, welcome to the Aussie Wire.
Hi, Topher. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Now, I haven't mentioned what you're doing, so people are going to be looking at the screen right now going, what in the mad world is Matt Lawson up to now?
Yeah, so I've decided to take the walk from Melbourne to Brisbane. I want to raise awareness for the jab injuries that are out there. There's a lot of people out there that are suffering. I know the compensation scheme closes in February of next year, and there's a lot of people that have lost jobs that can't get any compensation. So I'm trying to do this walk to raise awareness for Jab Injuries Australia.
It's absolutely fantastic. You left Melbourne yesterday. Where are you now?
Yesterday I walked 40 k's.
Right.
I've got to tell you, it was the most. I got Sundong to Broadford, so today's just going to be 20 k's.
It's just going to be 20 k's, only 20 k's. Like you say that like it's just some sort of a breeze. Do you have people meeting you and supporting you along the way? Are people sorting out accommodation for you? How's all that working?
Yeah, so I've got support crew going with me along the way. I've
Brilliant.
got one, a person who's following me. I've got other people coming along. Last night a motel put me up for free. I talked to them about jab injuries and they put me up for free.
Amazing.
I've got people pulling over now that are just dropping off some food just by chance right when you came on here. So the support's been, that wasn't set up. The support's been amazing.
Oh, look, it's absolutely brilliant to see. And Matt, I tip my hat to you. You are absolutely unstoppable. You've had more reasons than most to curl up in a ball and feel sorry for yourself, and you just refuse to quit. You refuse to do it. How can people support you? How can people support Jab Injuries Australia? And where can they follow the progress of your walk?
Yeah, so unfortunately I've had to jump back onto Facebook because it's the only thing where I'm not shadow banned at the moment.
Yeah, okay.
You can find me. My name on there is Mac, M-A-C-K, Dawson, because I can't go on as Matt Lawson anymore. My group page is called The Long Walk for Awareness of COVID Jab Injuries. And I had to sort of abbreviate the name because if I put it up properly, they shadow banned it. So
yeah, of course.
It's called The Long Walk for Awareness, but look for Mac Dawson on Facebook and follow me.
Yeah, well, look, what I'll do is I'll get those links from you directly and we'll make sure they're in the show notes underneath this video so that people can just click those links and find you. Massive respect to you, Matt. And Jab Injuries Australia, where would we find them?
So Jab Injuries Australia is on Instagram. Mm-hmm. They've got about 100,000 people following them. They've got links for donations. So I've already had around about $1,000 in the first day, which is a good start.
Yep.
They've got all the links for the donations on their Instagram page. So I'll send you that link as well.
Yeah, please do, Matt. And that's obviously the point, going for a long walk, putting yourself through a great amount of discomfort. I walked about 6 kilometres yesterday, just spending time with the kids and enjoying the new rural setting that I'm in. I don't want to back that up today with another 6Ks, let alone do 40 and then back it up with 20. So massive respect to you. We'll make sure all those links are in the show notes. I'll be following your progress and perhaps let's have you on a couple more times as you cross the entire southeast of this amazing continent that we call home.
Thanks, Topher. Thanks for putting it out there. And anyone who has a friend or family that's jab injured, just get involved, jump on the page, and happy walking.
All right, mate. I won't say enjoy yourself because I feel like that's probably wishing for a bit too much. But be safe. I hope you have a great time, and I hope that this walk is a tremendous success. All the best, Matt.
Thanks, Topher.
That's all for the Aussie Wire News today. We release new episodes of the Aussie Wire News every Tuesday and every Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com and follow us on all our socials at The Aussie Wire. And can I really encourage you to join our email list? We've had some issues with censors recently and, well, you know it can happen. So please head over to our website, theaussiewire.com, and join our email list. Finally, if you're in Perth, don't forget to grab your tickets to the Church and State Conference. Ticket link is in the video description. I'm Topher Field. And this is the Aussie Wire.